without further ado, I'm going to invite Tim Tompkins to join me up here. Tim, I'm not going to read off the big biography because I think everyone else, hopefully, as part of your invitation, you got to read more about him, and that's why you're here. But very quickly, I was very fortunate enough to sit on the board of the International Downtown Association with Tim. Tim was chair, and he actually helped lead the formation of the Canadian leadership portion of IDA. So we got to work very closely, and as I watched him in action and watched him speak at all the various conferences and visited him in Times Square, I realized this guy is career goals for me. So hopefully if I can do a fraction of what he's done here in Regina, we're going to be in a much better place. So Tim was with Times Square Alliance for 19 years, you said? 19 years. He's now a professor at New York University teaching urban planning, and he has his own consultancy, Shared City, Shared Space. And he is here to share his life experiences with us and hopefully inspire us all to do bigger, better things, think bigger, make those bold decisions, and be brave. So if you are in the back and you're finding you can't see, please feel free to move forward. Feel free to boot people out of their own chairs if you don't like them. That's okay too, no judgment. But there is some space over here and kind of tucked in and around, and I'm sure everyone knows everyone here because this is Regina. So here you go. Here's the main event.
No, I think you turned it off. How's the feedback? So thank you, Judith. I will have a little more to say about how great you are later. And thank you, Tony, also for being a host, and Lisa, and thank you, Mayor Masters, for this amazing city, which you'll hear why I feel so enthusiastic about the city. So get ready, we're going to go through a lot, and my theme is about thinking big and thinking small. As I said, I worked with Judith and Lisa at the International Downtown Association, but a lot of my work started off, and my perspectives on things started when I founded an organization called Partnerships for Parks to help neighborhood parks in New York City. And one of our signature projects was in the Bronx River. This big thing, been there, for hundreds of years, thousands of years. It was a mess, and people weren't connected to it. Huge, huge project, a big project, but yet it was a small thing that initially catalyzed people to do something. There was an artist who came up with the idea of floating a golden ball down the river. So this little action, and you think, how does that help? Well, artists help us see things in new ways, and if we, but the artist helps, having a ball go down the river brought people's attention to it, and guess what? You can't float a river down a ball if there's cars in there and if there's trees falling down. And so this small action became a catalyst for much larger actions. Actions like taking an old abandoned concrete plant and turning it into an amazing park. And that happened because of the intersection of civic, governmental, and other groups, the Bronx River Alliance, that made these small actions and these big actions all along the river change. Moved to Times Square, named after the New York Times building shown here, which was, when it was built, Times Square was called Times Square. But in the 70s and 80s, 42nd Street was the most dangerous block in America. There was prostitution, there was pornography, it was the image maker of New York City in a bad way. And people were desperate to change it. And part of my point is that they were so desperate to change it, there was a need for incentives and governmental action to take certain properties so that they could be repurposed for other uses. But in the process, they sort of overdid it. This is what the governor and the mayor at the time, when they announced, like, this is what the new Times Square is going to look like. And you know what's missing here? What's Times Square about? It's about signs and advertising. No signs and advertising. It's about the building that we just saw, the New York Times building, from which the New Year's Eve ball gets dropped. That's part of the identity. And it's about historic theaters. But they wanted to create Times Square Center, just like Rockefeller Center. Very similar buildings, everything looks like the same. So they almost, just in the process of trying to save Times Square, they almost destroyed it. Luckily, things slowed down. People said, wait a minute, this building after which Times Square is named, that the ball drops from, that's like, think about it, that would have been right in front of this building, but they're like, oh, it kind of destroys the sight lines for this nice corporate assemblage. So that slowed down. Also, people make provisions to protect the historic theaters, which are a key part, of course, both the architecture and the theater are a key part of the city's identity. And they actually passed a law requiring that if you build a building in Times Square, you have to have advertising signs on it. So that's a little lesson in like, you need these big tools, but you have to pay attention to how they intersect with the history and the nature of the neighborhood. At the same time, 1992, the Times Square bid was formed to take care of the small things. What's it like just walking around on the street? So it's about, do people feel safe? Because they're not cops, but they're public safety ambassadors. Picking up the trash, working with not-for-profit groups to really address in a nuanced and individualized way troubled people living on the street. Take our greatest asset, Broadway, have them do an outdoor concert to show that it's safe to be outside. Literally, it was a concern. And take New Year's Eve, which had kind of become a hot mess of an event, and make it into a televised branding event celebrating what is the best about New York. So 10 years later, our problem was not that you couldn't get through Times Square without getting killed. The problem was that you couldn't get through Times Square because people were coming back, and so our problem was congestion, pedestrian congestion. 68% of people said crime wasn't the big problem, but congestion. 96% of the people who worked in the neighborhood said they routinely walked in the streets because there wasn't enough room on the sidewalks. And we said, okay, if we're going to change the ground floor of Times Square, the experience of Times Square, let's think about our strengths and weaknesses. We got a branding and advertising firm to do a brand analysis of the core characteristics of Times Square. And they talked about how it's really this representation of New York City and cities in general. We talked to people that had written books about Times Square and said, what are these themes that you see throughout the decades of what Times Square represents? I'm not going to go into detail about them because it's about Times Square, but it's about the process of how we did this. And then we brought together artists and architects and planners and designers to say, physically, what does this space represent? How do we think about the people down on the ground, but also the amazing vertical template of the signs and other things? And from that, we came up with a series of principles and admonitions, things to be careful about not to do to destroy the essence of Times Square, but principles about what we wanted to affirm that guided us for the next 10 years. We started implementing that. We celebrated our sort of design and architectural assets. We brought in some more design people, not to do something that was really possible. We weren't going to paint the entire ground floor of Times Square this bright blue, but it helped people look at the space in a different way and say, oh, it's not just about this sliver of sidewalk in the street. This is like a great public square in a sense. But things didn't change. We did a lot of those little things and it made a difference, but nothing really shifted in terms of people's fundamental thinking about Times Square until we did a bigger project. And this is a place where you get discount tickets in Times Square. It's called Duffy Square. Terribly crowded, you see people flowing into the street. The only place, public space, like a park space, was where that statue is, and that was closed off. So you couldn't do anything. So we went and we built these red steps, and the next clip will tell you that changed the brand of the space and changed the way people thought about public space.
The TKTS booth in Times Square is a place to score discount show tickets. It is also famous for what is above it, the big red steps. Times Square marking 10 years since that staircase first opened to the public. Roger Clark is atop the steps this morning, learning more about their history. The TKTS booth was on that location forever, Roger, but now because of this piece of architecture, it's really a landmark.
Yeah, that's for sure. They started back in the 70s when Times Square was a little bit on the rough side, and they wanted to, bring business back. And, hey, the rest is history. Right now, I'm standing these. This is a great time to be in Times Square. Actually, it's my favorite time because there's nobody else here. I mean, there's still people, but this is great. I got the whole place to myself, all of Times Square. Pat, sometimes New Yorkers take these steps for granted. We do. But if you ask someone from elsewhere, they will say that this is pure New York City. Times Square, the crossroads of the world. So much going on. But up until 10 years ago,
there was literally no place to sit in Times Square at all.
In 2000, the Theater Development Fund, now TDF, kicked off a design competition to rethink its TKTS booth in Times Square at Father Duffy Square, 47th and Broadway. It took a while, but the result was the Times Square Steps, which are celebrating their 10th anniversary. Times Square Alliance President Tim Tompkins says it completely transformed the way people think about the neighborhood and gave them a place to rest their weary legs before the pedestrian plazas and seating were installed.
For the first time, people could hang out and watch what we say is the second best show on Broadway, which is watching the amazing life of New York City and Times Square.
The only skill is to connect it, not to support it.
Tompkins took me under the stairs for a behind-the-scenes look at the $19 million design wonder, entirely made and supported by glass. And its connection to Times Square?
They were steps that mimicked a Greek amphitheater, and of course is the theater district. And also, they had lights, and this is a place of lights and signs and advertising.
So the steps serve many purposes. You could buy discount tickets to Broadway and off-Broadway shows, or just hang out watching the world go by. A spot for Jay-Z and Alicia Keys to shoot a video, a tribute to the greatest city in the world. And for Will Smith to hunt in a New York decimated by a plague and post-apocalyptic mutants in the movie I Am Legend. And hey, 1, 2, 3, da, there we go. Da, 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 da. It's Broadway after all. Da, 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 da.
So, that project, first idea was in 2000. We didn't start building until 2009. We were over budget. It was late. It was a nightmare, but it got done, and 10 years later, that's the result. So sometimes a well-done, well-designed, contextual, physical intervention can really change a perception about a place, and that's what happened there. But there was more to be done, because the rest of Times Square we went back to the small things. We got a few more feet of sidewalk space from Department of Transportation, and then there was a big idea that the commissioner had under Bloomberg, which is like, hey, how about we close off one of those 2 streets, Broadway? People got nervous, and people were like, well, we took a deep breath, and we said, we want more space for pedestrians, but we did a small thing. We just closed off the street and put down beach chairs and lawn chairs. And this is the day it happened. You can tell it did not look pretty, but it's like people had spent their lifetime just hanging out in lawn chairs in the middle of Times Square. The change was instantaneous, and it captured people's imagination. Here too, it was not easy. Some people really hated it. And we had some operational problems keeping up with like this new use in the middle of the street. But then the tide started to turn, and we stuck with it. Best seats in Times Square. People made T-shirts celebrating these crazy lawn chairs. And then when we asked people, in Times Square, how's your experience in Times Square? It went from 43% to 74%. Just the closing down of Broadway and how that changed without doing any capital improvements. And so then we said, yes or no, make this permanent. Residents and locals said yes, the employees said yes, and so the mayor went ahead with the commissioner, made it permanent and built it out and made it great. And then the narrative started to change, because sometimes these key catalytic projects really can change the narrative. Hey, is this a place we might actually, because New Yorkers generally don't like Times Square, they like too many tourists there, it's not real Times Square, it's not cool. And it's a constant struggle for any place that's a tourist attraction, but the narrative starts to change. And of course, when the narrative changes, the people come, retail does better, the economy does better, and we become even more of an economic engine. And all that started with this paradigm-changing catalytic project and some of these small little experiments. So then we had into this space what we were going to do with it. So we wanted to bring life to it once it was built. Where we recreated the sailor nurse kiss in Times Square and had fun with it. We did a big yoga event in the middle of Times Square. I don't know if they found Nirvana, but we said, look, it's fine. Anybody can find peace of mind out in the middle of a prairie, but try doing it in the middle of Times Square, right? And we had some fun with it. We commissioned every year differently with new and emerging architectural firms, something that related to the theme of love for Valentine's Day, changed it out every time. Changing design and art is critical because you want people to keep coming, just like a new exhibition in a museum. We took some of our great cultural assets like the Metropolitan Opera and showed them on screens in Times Square. We took our great asset of the screens and started doing digital art on the screen. So we took our assets, combined it with the cultural and creative power of the city, and then we did a lot of smaller art projects, smaller scale things, and then sometimes some bigger ones like this one where we worked with the Queens Museum, which is like a museum that's far away from Midtown, and it was good for them because it exposed some new people to a new audience. It gave them some new audience exposure, but it also helped us because we were bringing this great cultural institution to the center of town. Then we decided to make this a more formal set of principles for ourselves for the next 10 years. We wanted Times Square to be the place that it draws on and celebrates the great assets of New York. And we did that in different ways. The design assets, how do we make sure that the furniture, the seats are really representative of the best of design? How do we experiment and commission new kinds of furniture? Lots of forms of small and larger public art. Again, tapping the cultural strengths of the entire city, which some people felt, again, historically from a brand point of view, that Times Square kind of lost. Bringing some, with mixed success, not everything works, it's all experiment. We tried to bring some of the great food entrepreneurs to do small pop-up kiosks in Times Square. Still some bugs to be worked out on how to make that work. And then sometimes, not just the big things like New York and New Year's Eve, but 3 times a week having a solo saxophone player in a busy public space is absolutely transformative what a single musician can do in terms of changing the vibe of a place. And finally, celebrating the things we had, our historic buildings, a 100-year-old restaurant, the theaters and the lights and the signs. So this is what we ended up doing that represented that.
Love is in the air in the heart of Times Square.
When you think about Times Square, small businesses might not be the first thing that comes to mind.
The Times Square Steps, which are celebrating their 10th anniversary.
The Lot Radio has been streaming live from a Times Square storefront.
Free yoga and wellness activities at the crossroads of the world.
This year's celebration in New York was dedicated to the freedom of the press.
Thank you, Times Square Alliance, for dedicating the ball drop to journalists working around the world trying to hold the line.
This is what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
To have Times Square turn into a food festival, I wish they would do this every month.
Times Square is the center of the world, in many senses of the word.
Behind me is the giant X that Suchi Reddy has created.
For me, this is a great place to express the love and the diversity that really this city is so proud of.
My name's Officer Chow. I work at Times Square Unit, NYPD.
My name is Mara Davi, and I am a Broadway actress.
We are with Broadway Up Close Walking Tours.
My name is Yasu Suzuki.
I'm Charlotte St. Martin, president of the Broadway League.
I'm Jane Dixon. I'm a painter focusing on my time and my place, and much of my time and place has been in Times Square.
So, things are booming, and then they're not, right? I know this town has also been through its cycles, the cyclone, the war, the depression, the end of the rail line. People count you out, they say it's over, forget about it, and then the whole world is watching and seeing that like something's changed. Sometimes it was just like our guys were the only people in the street. We're like, we're just gonna keep doing what we're doing. We're not gonna go and say, okay, everybody just go stay at home for 2 years. We kept it going, and by this year it was back. The show must go on, the curtain is up. We're not back at all of our numbers, but we're back. That's the kind of cycle that cities go through because the story is never over. What are some of these broader principles? And I've got a document I can share with folks afterwards if they're interested, or a link. If you're going to do that big intervention, design it well, whether it's a public space or whether it's a building. Manage it and manage the area around it well, and then program those public spaces consistently in a way that's authentic with the identity of the neighborhood. And maybe the neighborhood is representative of the entire city or the province, but that. No, experiment, do the little things, the big things, go test, and not every, what's right for Times Square, like closing down meeting, that's not right for Regina or for a lot of other cities. Everything is different depending on the context, but try out, experiment. You've got great relationships here between the public, the private, and the civic sector, and the bids, and you've got a great mayor that knows how to work with people and make connections. Government has certain powers and strengths. Private sector has certain powers and strengths, civic center as well. Tap all of those together. I'm going to go into more detail about this, but part of it is just knowing what you've got and loving it and nurturing that. And sometimes it's about gathering the facts and saying, you may think that this is what's going on. You may think we're dead or not interesting, but like, here's a set of facts and data, or here's a place, or here's something we've done that changes that narrative. And throughout it all, it's got to grow up from the community and the needs of the locals because they know what's going on, and be done consistently. We had to do a lot of small interventions, small art projects, day after day after day, because you do it once, the crowds won't come. You have to build an audience and build a thing. Then you've got to balance out, we're doing this, we're lighting this architectural building, we're doing this food festival, we're doing a frost festival, we're doing a major capital project. It's got to be part of a coherent set of plans where they are all different, but they intersect with each other. It's got to be concentrated. You can't do this everywhere. Choose one place where you're going to prove a whole set of new ideas, because if you're trying to do it citywide or even district-wide, you'll get spread too thin as you're working out the bugs. Always, it's creative people in culture and the arts and entrepreneurs who help you see things and do things in new ways. And again, give it time, take a breath. Sometimes there's a tipping point that it may seem like nothing's happening, and then it does. Turning to Jane Jacobs, a person who lived in New York and then decided it was better to live in Canada. What do we learn about public spaces? Is that part of what our work is to create a place where all the diversity in society and of our life is in a single place and mixing together. And I'm going to give you a few metaphors. Think about a petri dish where you have a bunch of different living organisms in there. You might be like, ew, gross. But you know, those different things mixed together, and that petri dish is where like the cure for COVID came from, by mixing together these different things. And we know that if you only have a single organism, this is the Habsburg lip, which was developed in the royalty of Europe because they were all interbreeding and there was no genetic diversity. And so you start to get deformed and dysfunctional, and you're weaker than, you know, your little kid, as long as it's not a serious thing. They get a sickness, they get an illness, they get a cold, and their immune system builds because they're exposed to something that's a little different, makes them a little uncomfortable, but they're stronger in the long run. That's what we're doing when we're building a great, vibrant city. Another metaphor, there's great dishes around the world, whether it's paella or jambalaya, where you're mixing together different foods, and always there's an element, in this case it's okra for the New Orleans dish jambalaya, that is you guys are creating the pan and you're putting in the mixing element that allows those different tastes to exist, but to create something better. Another metaphor, think about a jazz band. All these different people you're putting together, they're doing their own thing, but they're doing it respectfully, with respect to each other, and great music comes out of it, and it's different every single time. That's what the life of the city is about. So I want to go back to the notion of love yourself. Because when I was talking to Judith about what to do here, she said, well, you know, at one point she was like, I just want people to love downtown. And you know, sometimes like loving yourself, it seems like a very, you know, California idea. It's like, oh, just love me, you know, da da da. But you know what? It really is critical because it's the big, big difference between everything else. So how many people here have kids? Raise your hand if you have kids. Okay, put your hands down. How many have kids that are absolutely perfect? And I want you really think your kids are absolutely perfect? Okay. Now, raise your hand if you love your kids, right? So, same thing with the city. Like, there are some things that are good, there's some things that are not good. But what do? You look for the things that are there, that spark of what you love, and you nurture it, and you give it space to grow. And so, I'll give you the little tour of Regina that I had. So I get in the airport, and I'm like, all right, this is great. It says there's no place like home, right? For those who can't see it. And I'm like, okay, they're owning that this is a cold place, right? And they have a sense of humor about it, right? And I'm like, this is great. Then Judith gives me some things. I'm like, oh my God, this is a cool local beer, and it's a beer that celebrates Regina. I'm like, okay, check, that's great. Then, you know, I go on the website of the Regina Tourism Organization, and they talk about the riders, and they say, its fans are zealous. And I'm like, wow, zealous, that's an interesting word. You know, is it like zealous like Scotty the T-Rex, kind of like is zealous about eating little dinosaurs? Is it zealous like Jolly Roger on a Saturday night? Or is it like a different, or is it a zealous, the kind of zealous you love, which is like, no, we may look quiet, but we can really, our enthusiasm runs deep when we see something we love, right? Then there was this also fact from the, you know, Regina is the sunniest capital and one of its chilliest. And I'm like, though that's cities, you know, you're coexisting, these these things that some people might say is a liability with an asset. And where's the sun going to shine? So I look out, say, this is amazing Central Park. It's beautiful. I get decked out in the Frost Festival. I hear about the Frost Festival, Judith is giving this stuff, which is a celebration of the cold and like bringing the city to life, which is great. I look at this building, and it's the federal building. I'm like, that is a stunning piece of architecture. And you know, it's amazing what cities have done when they just shine lights on a beautiful building. Doesn't matter what's going on inside. Shine lights on a beautiful building and connect the dots. It's amazing. I go and I say, this is a sign of love. Someone that's saying, not only like, here's how you get around, but then there's like an old electric box that tells us the history of this hotel because of rap. I'm like, that someone is paying attention and saying, I love this place. Beautiful, again, good bones, beautiful, go through the park. This, Judith told me, is these are boxes where you're creating basically these blocks of snow, which are going to be during frost, where artists are going to come and create their own sculptures. So I'll return to that thought a little bit later. And then seeing this amazing performing arts space, seeing outdoor temporary art exhibitions, seeing these kind of temporary design interventions, which are fun, which engage people, which nurture and celebrate and give money to sort of the artists and designers that are doing great work in the city. A visitors center that is like full of enthusiasm for the city itself. Really good, I pay attention to like what's down on the ground, like really good pavers and pavement that's like high quality. It doesn't say this is just concrete or a concrete sidewalk or pavement. This is a place that like is high quality, that sends a message that we care, and a great place to like warm yourself up and then walk over to that library. And I know that for a bunch of reasons relating to ADA and libraries are much richer institutions, that this building is probably not the best place for this library to continue to be. But architecturally, I just want to say, it's already got some cultural and other activities going on in there. I think that's a distinctive asset for perhaps other uses that could be great for the city. And then when you look out, you come out of the library and you see this is what a city is about. You've got a historic and interesting facade. You have a new tech company. You have a new glass building. You've got that richness of the city. And this, I don't know if this is the logo that's everywhere. When I'm just walking along the north side of the park, I'm like, this is beautiful. Like this. That graphic of the Bank of Canada is stunning. And then I see the infrastructure and I see, okay, somebody's paying attention, doing some nice artwork here. But I'm like, well, graffiti, come on, get on it. It's great that it's that's been improved, but you got to the second that happens where somebody defaces that, you got to change it. I saw this and it made me think, when you're bringing a city to life, it's not just a good thing anyway. You're celebrating Canada, but you're also generating economic activity. Those things go hand in hand. You bring vitality, you bring economic energy, and you bring economic energy, and you're bringing vitality. I think you guys all know that. And then speaking of vitality, here Judith took the colors of her organization's logo and brightened this amazing modernist building in just a basic, simple way. Across the street, very different kind of architecture. This amazing building here with the little shopping arcade inside. And threshold makes me think, this city's on the threshold of something. Funky shops like Madame Yes, and some great posters celebrating the history of Regina, and bone and broth. And I thought, yes, this city has good bones. But how do you make a great soup? You need the broth, right? And the broth in this case is the people. So how are you going to get the people here? Because part of it is get the people from the rest of Regina to come to downtown. And some of that is through this temporary smaller scale programming. How do you get people from the province to come to downtown? Get people from around Canada to come downtown. For that, you probably need a bigger demand driver, which is as I understand it, the exhibition center of the library, these bigger projects that are reasons for people to make a trip. I met with people in Sydney, Australia, and they said, everybody says, oh, at some point I want to go to Australia. But what their whole economic development and tourism strategy is to create events, some sporting events, some cultural events, that make people say, I want to go there because this is happening. And that's what you can do when you've got the right kind of venues and the right kind of thing. So the broth, you've got the bones, the broth of the people, bringing the residents, bringing the visitors, locally and internationally. Again, mixture of architecture on the street, got excited. Transit is a key part of making a downtown work better. Went into this transit center and I was like, oh, this is not the right message. You've got great on the outside, not so good on the inside. We can do better. While I was there, someone very deeply troubled, shouting, walking down the street. I think everybody knows that those little details, I saw it also a smashed window here at the Cure. Those little details, they happen once in a while, it's one thing. If it happens a lot, you've got to pay attention. You've got to be the solution is not to arrest people, and the solution is to have a complex, individualized response to troubled people who have issues with mental illness and addiction. It's not only about housing, it's about housing plus these other wraparound services, and it's about, when crime happens, whether it's graffiti or a plywood, smashed window, got to replace it quickly. But then looking in there and seeing the amazing mix of musical offerings that are available in there, going and seeing this Legion House, and again, light that up. You go inside and it's like a temple. It's beautiful. Across the street may not be so pretty, you got a garage, but there's so many cities in the world that figured out ways to make a parkade, look good. And it's important for the fabric of the city. You can make it look good. So I'm going around here and I'm like, I'm seeing Regina's greatest hits. And I go see the comic shop. I see like what characters in the comic shop. I'm like, this is so cool. And I'm like, but somebody's noticed it and is loving it. Someone says thank you for coming by here. And then, I see you've got major brands. You've got major brands that are integrated into the old, bringing the old and the new. You've got the globe, and this picture, you've got the old and the new in this picture, and you zoom in, and that's what a city's about, a mosaic. Each thing looks a little different, but together they make this amazing picture. And I thought, okay, 2024, celebrate not just the opening of the globe, but celebrate all of your cultural assets. I saw this and I thought, okay, this is the area that feeds the body of Canada, right? It provides the nutrients for the body. Let it also be a place that feeds the spirit and soul with all of your cultural and other offerings and entertainment offerings. When this place, because Judith had told me to go there, once again, you see these little posters that show all the culture, all the little things happening. You may be in the drag shows, you may be in a classical piano, it's all there. And you got a great bun, and then once again, but somebody noticed, somebody's celebrating it. So I was like, okay, well I want to walk over to the, to the warehouse district, because that's cool. See some great stuff along the way that shows that people care. See a Vietnamese restaurant, reminded of the diversity of the city, and these little signs that people care. This is tough, it's very hard. How you create a connection between the vibrancy of downtown and the vibrancy, how to get there, whether it's walking or a shuttle loop, those are big things. And then I got to the destination, which is important, which is this amazing place, which is Rebellion, which also is celebrating not just creativity and great beer, but also the arts. I go along and I see these kinds of details. A bench, sit here, but it's beautifully made and beautifully done. I see there's a ukulele sale, and I'm like, okay, so get all the ukulele players in Canada and have like a ukulele fest in Victoria Park. Have fun with this, and because I saw all these ways in which music is happening in this city, and that leads to a revival. The revival of not just buildings, but also the celebration of things local, which is what that amazing project, the Warehouse, is doing with these small makers, and looking at the next place where that kind of intervention is going to happen. So, start here. Let's get going. Start now. What's it mean? Don't get hazy. Don't get double hazy. You guys know what you got, right? This is the way we feel sometimes in the morning. Don't just don't bury yourself under doubt and oh my God, what am I going to do? This was in The Cure. This says, you must break the pattern today or the loop will repeat tomorrow. This, from what I understand, is an indigenous symbol. You're at a threshold. It's time to say, Madame, yes, yes, Madame. We're going to do it. Time to get in your Regina rocket ships and take off. How do you do that? It's by focusing like a laser on what you have that is great. Never give up on the things that make you smile. Never stop shining the sun on the things that you think are great about your city. You have these blocks of snow that are there. Take those boxes off. Invite the creative people in your community, including all of you, to make something new and special out of that. You've got the bones, you've got the good bones, bring the broth, and part of that means also getting your allies out there. You guys are the starting superheroes. You guys get out the hobgoblins and the orc rangers, whatever they are, whoever your version of that is, as allies, to celebrate what this is. And yes, get zealous. Zealous in that way where it's like, yeah, we got something good here. Get zealous, don't get jealous. It's not about what somebody else has. So how do you get zealous? You put on your gear, you say, this is Frost, we're getting ready to go. You get like the Rough Riders, and you say,